As in our own day, factionalism divided people and gave rise to improbable explanations for the causes for Jean's death. For the Protestants, the Reverend Woodrow reported the following. She is said to have been a bitter enemy of Presbyterians and to have expressed her wish that if she ever listened to a Protestant sermon, the house would fall upon her. Being in Rotterdam, after she was Lady Kilsyth, she had strayed in to hear a sermon in the Scots church there, and next night her lodgings fell and smothered her and her child. For the Royalists, the blame for Jean's death lay squarely on the Presbyterian Covenanters. There were considerable numbers of members of Scotland's persecuted church living in exile in Holland at the time the Kilsyths arrived there. And it was said that those embittered Covenanters entered into a plot to take revenge on some of the Scots nobility whom they saw as the cause of their banishment and sufferings. And so the story goes, they sawed through the supports of the roof of the room where the Kilsyths were lodging, and then, at a prearranged signal, let the tons of peat fall upon them. But for Lord Kilsyth at this point, his greatest concern was, what now? Here he was, banished from his own country, with no fixed abode in his place of exile, but needing to bury his wife and son. How could he find a final resting place for them? The death certificate still in the Utrecht archives gives us a hint. After noting the identities, erroneously referring to Lord Kilsyth as Viscount Dundee, and giving the reason for death as the fall of the turf, the entry ends in a cold, business-like manner with the information exported to Scotland. To repatriate his wife, Lord Kilsyth had her body and that of their son embalmed by the most expert morticians, using costly nards and ointments. Then, having received a special dispensation from the British authorities, who were moved by the tragedy of the case, he was permitted a brief stay to accompany the coffin back to Scotland and to see his wife and son interred in his family vault under the local church in Kilsyth. Some years later, Lord Kilsyth was allowed to come back from exile and take up residence again at the Colseum estate. Soon after that, his elder brother James, 2nd Viscount Kilsyth, decided to relinquish the title in favour of his younger brother. And so William Livingston, Lord Kilsyth, became William Livingston, 3rd Viscount Kilsyth. Despite his assurances to the authorities after the failed 1689 revolt that he was the sincerest of penitents, Viscount Kilsyth never in reality gave up his royalist convictions. And in 1715, when the winds of opportunity for the return of the Stuart king seemed to be blowing again, he threw in his lot once more with the supporters of former King James against the government. With the collapse of that Jacobite uprising, he realised there would be no mercy a second time, and he fled the country. In his absence, his estates were confiscated by the Crown and eventually passed to the Edmonstone family. Once again in exile, Viscount Kilsyth remarried and had a daughter, but she died in childhood. Kilsyth himself died in Rome in 1733 without any heir. His only brother too had never married and also died childless. And so the Kilsyth lineage came to an end, as did the title. But it's not the end of our story. You remember It was said that Lady Dundee had dropped her ring in the garden of the Kilseum estate, and that Lord Kilsyth had dropped his soon after. Well, a full 100 years later, in 1796, a gardener here at Kilseum was digging and turned up a gold ring. It was a simple ring without any stone, but bearing an inscription on the inside, "Yours only and ever," written in a style archaic even for the period. At first the gardener considered it nothing of great value, but then he remembered the story of the lost rings and made the assumption that this must be the one Lady Dundee had dropped. Some years later, another larger gold ring was found nearby, carrying the inscription, "Yours till death." Since it was obviously a man's ring, the assumption was made that it must be the one Lord Kilsyth dropped. Whoever the misfortunate owners were who lost them, they themselves had long since been in the grave when their precious tokens of love were at last found. And so we can never know for sure. But it's a touching coda to our romantic tale. A coda perhaps, but it's far from the end of our walk with Jean Cochrane, Lady Dundee. The real epilogue to her story is something that sounds as if it comes from the realm of fiction. Were it not for, unlike the ring story, this time we have detailed written eyewitness accounts and even an eyewitness illustration. You'll remember how William Livingston, Lord Kilsyth, was devastated when his beloved Jean was so suddenly and tragically taken away from him, and how he had her and her son's bodies embalmed and brought back here to Kilsyth to rest in a vault beneath the church. But you may also remember that I said at the beginning that the bodies lie under this watchtower and that there's no church in sight. Well, let me explain. For long after Lord Kilsyth had died, Jean's coffin lay in the vault of Kilsyth Parish Church, which indeed once stood right here. The minister of that church in the 1790s was the Reverend Dr. Robert Rennie, who was said to have been an exceedingly faithful pastor with an energetic and successful ministry, but also that he had an acute and capacious mind and that nothing escaped his observant eye. In 1796, around the same time that the first ring was found near Kilseum, a remarkable discovery was made in the vault under this church. About a year later, the Reverend Rennie invited Thomas Garnet, Professor of Natural Philosophy at the new Anderson College in Glasgow, to come and see the marvel for himself. Thomas Garnet tells us that he received an invitation to Kilsyth in order to see a curious mummy which had been discovered in a vault under the church nearly a year before. He continues, "The vault had been closed up, but Mr. Rennie had the goodness to order an opening to be made, through which we descended with difficulty, but were amply repaid for our trouble, for though the body was by no means in that high state of preservation that it was when first discovered, still it was wonderfully perfect. Mr. Watts took a drawing of it, which he afterwards corrected under the eye of Mr. Rennie, so as to make it exactly resemble the appearance of the body when first discovered." At that, he hands over to the Reverend Rennie to give a description of the discovery the previous year. Mr. Rennie informs us that since his childhood he had often been in the vault, and so he had known of this leaden coffin all his life. But no one ever thought of opening it till the spring 1796, when some rude, regardless young men went to visit the tomb, and with sacrilegious hands tore open the leaden coffin. To their surprise, they found under the lead a covering of fur, as clean and fresh as if it had been made the day before. The cover of this being loose was easily removed. With astonishment and consternation, they saw the body of Lady Kilsyth and her child, as perfect as the hour they were entombed. For some weeks this circumstance was kept secret, but at last it began to be whispered in several companies, and soon excited great and general curiosity. On the 12th of June, while I was away from home, great crowds assembled and would not be denied admission. At all hours of the night as well as the day, they afterwards persisted in gratifying their curiosity. I saw the body soon after the coffin was opened. It was quite entire. Every feature and every limb was as full. Nay, the very shroud was as clear and fresh, and the colours of the ribbons as bright as the day they were lodged in the tomb. What rendered this scene more striking and truly interesting was that the body of her son and only child, the natural heir of the title and estates of Kilsyth, lay at her knee. His features were as composed as if he had been only asleep. His colour was as fresh, and his flesh as plump and full as if in the perfect glow of health. The smile of infancy and innocence sat on his lips. His shroud was not only entire, but perfectly clean, without a particle of dust upon it. He seems to have been only a few months old. The body of Lady Kilsyth was equally well preserved, and at a little distance, with the feeble light of a taper, it would not have been easy to distinguish whether she was dead or alive. The features, nay, the very expression of her countenance, were marked and distinct, and it was only in a certain light that you could distinguish anything like the ghastly and agonising trace of a violent death. Not a single fold of her shroud was discomposed, nor a single member impaired. But no description can give a just or adequate idea of the neatness or elegance of her appearance. I therefore refer to the sketch taken by your friend. I have only to lament that his representation was finished chiefly from my description, as at the time you saw the body, it was much sullied, and the shroud injured. But it is as near at the original as I can recollect, or as any pencil can express. I can only say it is not a flattering likeness. Thomas Garnett adds the following postscript. To this account given by Mr. Rennie, I can only express my regret that this body which had been so admirably preserved should be wantonly destroyed or damaged. Had it been enclosed in a glass case when discovered, it would in all probability have remained for centuries in the same state. Sometime later, another writer was more forthright in giving his opinion on the Reverend Rennie's handling of the affair, when he stated bluntly, "How he allowed this scandalous exposure of the remains of Lady Dundee to continue is wholly unaccountable, and by no means to his credit. It was not that they might become a parochial spectacle that Lord Kilsyth spent his affection on the remains of his dead wife. And that brings us back to where we started, to this little watchtower here in Kilsyth graveyard. The Edmonstone family, which had been granted the Colseum estate confiscated from William Livingston, the last Viscount Kilsyth, also received the use of the burial vault, which contained the body of Jean Cochrane. Around 1820, the old church, which stood here, was demolished and a new one built at a little distance from here. But it seems that the burial vault wasn't relocated. Being the height of the body snatching time, this watchtower was constructed as a place for the bereaved to keep vigil over the graves of their newly buried loved ones. In 1832, the Anatomy Act of Parliament brought order and regulation to the whole affair, and watchtowers became a relic from the past. In the 1850s, Sir Archibald Edmonstone of Colseum had the vault under the now disused watchtower opened in order to place there the coffin of a deceased relative. He says he was shocked to find the remains of Lady Dundee displaced and the body perfectly shrivelled and discoloured. And what surprised me, he continues, was that in the sketch the child was lying at the feet, whereas now it was lying on her breast. I immediately ordered the body to be walled up within the vault, so that it would never be exposed again, and I have put up a memorial inscription on the spot. And so we come to the end of the fascinating but tragic story of Lady Dundee. And now we're in a position to fully understand the inscription placed here by Sir Archibald, and to appreciate the significance of this little building in Kilsyth graveyard with, to quote Winston Churchill, its riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma.